Very good. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's NERI Seminar series. I'm delighted to have today as our presenter, Dr. Eoin Flaherty, Assistant Professor of Sociology in Maynooth. A lot of his research interests relate to systems of cooperation, collective resource management, how that holds up in the face of environmental pressures, and more, I suppose, linked to the topic today, also an interest in patterns of inequality across time. So today's presentation will be looking at a paper that Eoin published recently with, co-authored with Professor Seán Ó'Riain, and that is Labour's declining share of national income in Ireland and Denmark, the national specificities, structural change. Before I hand over to Eoin, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions over the course of the presentation, we'll be collecting them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any question, pop that in there. I'm the chair, so I can present that to Eoin after he finishes his presentation. So please do send in your questions if you have them. In the meantime, I will leave things to Eoin. Eoin, you can start sharing your slides if you like, and take things away.
Thanks, Paul. So I've got them maximized on my screen now. Maybe could you just let me know if they're showing up okay?
They are, we see them.
That's cool. And the audio is okay?
Everything's great.
Great, thanks, Paul. Yeah, thanks for the intro, Paul. I guess it's, even though you said recently published, the origins of this paper go back to about 2013 on a project with Seán Ó'Riain. So I should say this is based on research completed by both myself and Seán, and the paper went through many iterations and revisions, I guess, before the final one appeared finally last year. And I suppose it's substantively different to what we started with in 2013 in terms of the explanation, but it also prompted me to think a little bit about some of the changes and advances in our understanding of the concept that have come about since then. So I suppose today, what I want to do maybe is just talk through the findings of the paper. As I said, the paper is published, the results are out there, and I'll talk maybe quickly through the results of the study, just the empirics of it, under point one, the comparative dynamics of labour share in Ireland and Denmark. In my own experience, it's not particularly interesting going through, bits of regression tables and model specification and so on, although I'm happy to maybe take questions on those afterwards if anyone wants to know a little bit more about the modeling strategy. And then I thought the second thing I would do, maybe to make it a bit more current and maybe more relevant to the remit of NERI, would be to talk about how this particular study of labour share relates to some advances and developments in the study and conceptualization of social class that have appeared in the last 6 to 7 years. So there's a sense in which the study of labour share has moved from this sort of oddity as a component of overall income inequality to something that's becoming a little bit more fundamental to systems of class and stratification. So I maybe want to say a little bit about that in the context of new research on things like asset-based models of stratification. So I'll talk a bit more about that afterwards. And as we go through this, I will say a little bit about how our specific methodology tried to address another methodological problem in the wider field of political economy, which is the predominance of pool time series cross-sectional models or long panel models in the study of income inequality. Our contention in the paper was that there's actually quite a lot that can be, there's a lot of value in these approaches, of course, but there's a lot that can be lost by kind of pooling countries together, combining them and assuming that everything works in the same way, sort of net of all that complexity. So maybe I'll start just by talking kind of more pedestrian about the definitions that we employ in the paper. And the definition of labour share that we follow in the paper is kind of consistent, I suppose, with most published research, which is that labour share is essentially the share of compensation going to employees and the self-employed out of the total pool of national product. Now, the various sort of the denominator and the new and so on are kind of interchangeable or are sort of conceptualized and measured in different ways. In some studies, you'll see the bottom figure is GDP, GNP. In our case, we use gross national income, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment when we get to the models. But basically, when we talk about labour share, what we're doing is we're taking, usually from the national accounts with a little bit of adjustment, the total value of wages and compensation going to employees and the self-employed in the economy, expressed as a percentage of total national product. It's referred to variously in the literature as the labor share or the wage share. So you'll see it appearing under different names in different papers. Why it's such a curiosity, I suppose, is that there's one sense in which it's sort of a fundamental of classical political economy that sort of got lost in the 60s, 70s, and 80s with this renewed emphasis on the distributional consequences of growth. So in the post-war period, when especially in economics, when these sort of critical papers were coming on the back of works like Simon Kuznets and so on, and where people were trying to make sense again of the resurgence of inequality in the 1980s and the Reagan and Thatcher era, some of the emphasis on labor share became lost. In Ricardian political economy, it was quite central, it appears, and Marxism, of course, is a very fundamental concept in a slightly different conceptual guise. But what was remarkable to us at the start of this research process was the extent to which it remains sort of a fundamentally unchallenged assumption in some branches of macroeconomics that the labor share is more or less constant. I'll talk about why this is the case in the next slide, but basically there is a presumption related to the concept of the elasticity of factor substitution that any changes in, for example, let's say technology and so on the production process side will be compensated for by adjustments on the labor side. So in a sense, to kind of boil that down completely, there's a presumption in a lot of the classical growth models that labor share has remained constant and should indeed remain constant or be self-correcting over the long run. As we move sort of further into the 2000s, we realize that that's patently not the case. And although there have been instances where it has remained remarkably stable up to the 70s and 80s in some countries, the predominant trend in Europe and certainly in Anglo-Saxon nations, and now also in China and transitional economies like Mexico and so on, is that it's very much not, that it's been falling almost uninterrupted across advanced capitalist democracies for the last 30 years in some cases. As of 2015, Ireland recorded one of the fastest and steepest rates of trend decline in all of Europe over the period 1980 to 2010. Things look a little bit different on the eve of the financial crisis, but I'll say more about that towards the end. So in our paper, what we wanted to do was confront, I guess, some conventional understandings about what causes or what really is driving this change in the labor share that we observe in many countries across Europe since the 1970s. And we tried to relate this or to kind of discuss this in terms of the conventional understandings of what drives changes in the labor share. And the first one, as I said, is there is a presumption in the macroeconomic literature, or at least there was in the early 2000s and so on. It's certainly weakening somewhat in the wake of a resurgence of interest amongst economists in the wake of the works of Piketty and so on. There was the assumption that labor share was self-equilibrating. Of those studies that recorded or suggested that it wasn't, there was a strong emphasis on the skill-biased technological change hypothesis. And this was an approach that placed technology as central, that said that even though we are seeing a fall in labor share, it's largely due to computerization and what they refer to as the skill-biased wage premium. In other words, along with changes in computerization, automation, and technological upskilling that goes with that, there was also a change in the wage premium that was attracted by those jobs, which led to, in a sense, a shift in the balance on the capital side and allowed for increasing productivity and accumulation on the capital side. Those workers who were able to capitalize on that through specific sets of skills did well, but in other words, the net effect of that was an increase in the wage gap between skilled and unskilled labor and an increase in returns to the capital side, due largely to automation and the productivity gains that go along with that. As I said at the start, we were concerned that quite a lot of these studies relied on pooled analyses and that they assumed that the effects of the different sort of factors that were thought to be related to changes in the labor share looked more or less or operated more or less similarly across countries. That, for example, changes in foreign direct investment in one country versus another country were really more or less the same. They worked through countries' national institutions the same. They produced the same kind of effects. And where we departed from this was by attempting to broaden out the analysis to look a little bit more about what was going on particularly on the labor side of things with regard to workers' falling bargaining power. So in our approach, we placed the concept of workers' bargaining power at the center of this analysis. And we looked not just at sort of the conventional indicators of workers' bargaining power like unions, unionization density, strike capacity, strike intensity, but also things like bargaining centralization, the extent to which different economic sectors were covered by either nationally binding compacts or sectorally binding compacts, and so on. And we also tried to broaden this out and incorporate some of the emerging literature on financialization that looked at very, very fundamental changes in the incentives and the practices of corporate governance, where firms were increasingly managed not in the interests of employees' well-being, but in the interests of their market performance, but more specifically their share price. So there's a large literature which I don't really talk about too much in this presentation. There's more in the paper that goes into sort of the financialization as a driver in the driving down of labor's conditions. And also there were many studies that looked at the role of internationalization and globalization as a source of wage competition for domestic workers. And in those studies that did look at international competition, what they had determined was that the greater the extent of international competition, the greater the wage depressive effect was in the domestic or incumbent economy. So this is a line of explanation that appears a lot in studies of the United States, which is the sort of Asian production effect where low-skill production is moved offshore, and then that introduces a competitive effect with regard to domestic wage and has the effect of depressing domestic wages. So we tried to look at this more from a power resources point of view, to look at what was going on there on the labor side, rather than just simply looking at changes in technology or changes on the macroeconomic or capital side. The other thing that we tried to do, and again, the logic of us sort of approaching this from the point of view of a comparative rather than a pool design, and the reason we were looking at Ireland and Denmark specifically is because we saw these as exemplars of the different kinds of comparative capitalisms. Now, there are many ways of approaching this idea of comparative capitalisms, many ways of kind of parsing up different countries into groups and so on. At the time, we were particularly concerned with representatives from what were considered, I suppose, the most conventional binaries, and these are ones from the varieties of capitalism approach, where you have on the one hand coordinated market economies with more centralized bargaining systems, with more of an integrated sort of partnership model of wage bargaining, and also countries with much higher extents or shares of public spending, not just social spending, not just sort of direct spending on services, but also the universality of those services. And again, conventional understanding would suggest that when we compare liberal market economies and coordinated market economies, we see substantial differences in terms of the reservation wages of those economies. In other words, in coordinated market economies, workers should be more insulated from the vagaries of capitalist hiring and firing because of their ability to access social services, not just in the form of sort of monetary compensation, but also things like education, healthcare, and so on. So this public spend, social spend generates this effect, which is known in the literature as the reservation wage. By contrast, liberal market economies are characterized more by individualized bargaining, so less widespread coverage across sectors, and a system where workers are more reliant on their own individual skill profiles, their own personal, to use the term, human capital resources to bargain their way towards better conditions, which again in liberal market economies tends to work more on an individual basis. We also observe in liberal market economies more rapid rates of destandardization and retrenchment. That's deregulation of working conditions, which can include things like falling contractual security. It's not just deunionization, but it's also weakening of the direct workplace conditions of workers, the contractual protections they enjoy, and so on. And while this is certainly not a clear-cut division, of course, coordinated market economies like Denmark have experienced turns towards flexicurity in the 80s, 90s, and then further destandardization and retrenchment in the 90s and 2000s. This does continue to mark in some respects a fundamental difference between at least the rates and extents of these protections and also the rates and extents of social spending in these two contexts. So our attempt to broaden out this conceptual model of drivers of labor share was to look at this across kind of two domains. And in the paper, but also in an earlier chapter written around 2015, 2016, myself and Seán approached this from the point of view of Polanyian political economy. So we looked at this from the point of view of the concept of the double movement. In other words, our sort of question was, what happens where we take two contexts with fundamentally different institutional structures that are exposed to more or less the same stressors? What is the sort of the pushback or the response on the labor side or the political side in terms of protections or buffering against those vagaries of marketization? So in a sense, what you're looking at here is the structure of, excuse me, of our empirical model as well. So we divide this up into two domains. We have one set of models that looks at the effects of structural change and marketization using a particular set of variables, and another set of models that looks at the impact of different political and labor market institutions on labor share. In the first domain, we look at global trade, we look at service sector growth, high-tech employment, and we look at these principally to get a sense of the impact of these different dimensions on the labor share within this particular domain. So the effects of globalization, sectoral economic change, and also, as would be expected, variations in things like the business cycle, recessions, and so on, times of growth and times of recession. On the labor and the political side, then we look at union density, welfare spending, extensive foreign direct investment, and also government partisanship, although for the sake of time, I'll only cover a few of these in detail because I don't want to go on for too long on these. And in a sense, what we're trying to capture here are the effects of, or the extent to which these different factors offer protections or buffeting against the processes that we note up here. And these include things like bargaining centralization, decommodification, so the extent to which someone's entitlements to benefits are not tied to their participation in the labour market necessarily as they would be in a liberal market economy like Ireland. And also to try and capture different extents of market coordination, whether that's government activity in coordinating the conditions of competition, or whether it's coordination in the labour market, which can include things like rules and laws around subcontracting and contractual security and so on. So our basic conceptual model is that between the two countries, between Ireland and Denmark, again, as sort of exemplars of these two worlds of capitalism, we should see fundamentally different responses in the models in terms of how these different factors either work to enhance or to mitigate labour share over the long run, and indeed over the short term. So these are dynamic models, which I'll talk about in a second, that try to capture the short term and the long term effects. So on the left-hand side here, we have an illustration of Ireland, and on the right-hand side of Denmark. Our time series covers 1960 to 2012. And what I did today was, what I'd hoped to do for today was to go back to the Amico data series and maybe have a look and see how things had changed in the interim between when we last analysed this. And certainly this trend decline has continued well beyond the immediate post-recession years as captured here from 2010 to 2012. And in the Irish case, we see, again, one of the reasons that we use gross national income is that there's a considerable difference between the labour share if we just look at the GDP versus the GNI denominator. The effect is much more muted in the Danish context. In the Irish case, we're controlling out some of the transfer pricing effect that gets sort of lost if we just rely on if we just rely on GDP. So at particular points, there's up to a 15 percentage point difference within certain time periods between the GNI and the GDP labour share. So the GNI labour share not only sort of averages out or parses out the effects of multinational presence on the national accounts, you can see it also compresses some of the dynamics somewhat. It makes those kind of peaks and troughs a little less. But nonetheless, the trend is fairly clear that the rate of decline in Ireland has been particularly sharp since the 1980s, over the Celtic Tiger period, especially strong. And this little aberration here, I suppose, bears comment because this is something that's found in countries across the world over the period of the Great Recession, which is this uptick in labour share over the period 2007 to 2009. Because we note in the data series afterwards, there's a more or less uninterrupted trend decline up to 2015, 2016. And this is due to change principally in the GDP GNI denominator. In other words, because the change in GDP preceded the fall in employment and the increase in unemployment, what you're seeing here is sort of a functional response to a change in the GDP denominator, but a relatively stable wage bill. So in other words, this isn't necessarily reflective of any kind of underlying change in labour's fortunes, obviously given the experience far from it of that time, but it does reflect a change, a sort of a functional change in GDP rather than any sort of significant or consequential change in labour's bargaining power. Now, if we just look at this in terms of rates and differences in the first instance, we see, and again, all this diagram is showing here is changes in rates. These are period-specific rate trends or average changes. And we see here over the period 1973 to 1980 There was more or less comparable growth in the Irish and the Danish series. That growth begins to slacken a little bit in the 80s to the 90s, but Ireland's rate of decline continues unabated all the way into the pre-recession years, pre-financial crisis years. But the differences really start to become apparent in the 1994 to 2001 period, where that trend decline in Ireland really starts to accelerate and take off, and continues, again, in terms of the difference between Ireland and Denmark, all the way up towards the immediate pre-GFC era of 2001 to 2007. So kind of the peak of the Celtic Tiger here. Over that period, just to exemplify some of the institutional changes that were occurring in both countries, we see here we've got an illustration of union density in Denmark, union density in Ireland from 1960 up to 2010. On the bottom graph, we've got Ireland, and Ireland's union density begins to fall principally around 1980, about 1982. And by the late 1990s, we start to enter this period of more or less free fall all the way up through the social partnership years, down to this sort of bottoming out in the mid to late 2000s, around 26-27%. The Danish series remains somewhat more stable. It records growth over the same period that Ireland is more or less peaking here in the 1980s. It sees some declines from its peak of 80% in the 1980s, but it remains more or less stable. And certainly the difference, the gulf in rates between these two countries is considerable. Now, in terms of our models, what we were looking for, what we were trying to capture, again, as I said at the start, were what do we miss if we rely solely on pooled analysis? Again, as the majority of studies tended to do. And the conventional approach to this would have been to take a pool of OECD countries, a pool of global countries, defined by whatever metric, transition countries, developed economies, developing, and so on, to pool those countries together to maximize the sample and to examine the effect of computerization or service employment or trade, sort of net of all those individual countries' characteristics. Indeed, it was often a feature of these models that sort of what individual heterogeneity would be controlled out by the model specification. What we discovered in adopting this sort of paired comparison approach was that there are considerable differences in the impact that these different stressors have in Ireland versus Denmark. If we look at the computerization effect, what this variable is capturing here is the effect of employment in computer services, or changes in employment in computer services. It's positive in both contexts, but we see quite a difference in the rate, and we see quite a difference in the effect size between both. So what we see in Ireland is that the returns, if you like, there's a positive effect, first of all, in the Irish case. Increasing employment in computer services is associated with a positive growth in labour share. We would expect that in liberal market economies because, again, computerization over the period 1980 to 1990 was a sector that attracted a pretty strong compensation premium. It was highly individualized, and it was a sector of highly mobile workers. Workers tended to move from organization to organization, acquiring skills, and sort of the classic, assuming the classic kind of human capital arguments hold, this was the route to greater enhancement of their own returns. It was individualized. In the Danish case, it's quite different. Yes, there's a competitive skill premium, but again, in Denmark, it's not as exposed to the global vagaries of technology-driven growth as somewhere like Ireland was. And again, the overall wage growth effect is more or less compressed in this context as well. There's much greater compression of those intersectoral wage differences. So the benefits of computerization are more widely spread, certainly, in the Danish context, but they're considerably stronger in the Irish context, as we'd expect computerization to attract a much stronger wage premium, but much more individually focused on the individuals in question rather than the wider sector. Service employment is something that's studied quite often in studies of inequality. It's looked at with respect to Gini coefficients, the income shares of the top 1%, and so on. And service employment is usually correlated with rising inequality because of its association with employment destandardization. It tends to exhibit low rates of unionization, low levels of contractual security, seasonality. There's age effects as well in terms of the age profile of workers, and so on. What we found is that in Ireland, the effect is negative. So an increase in service employment, again, as you might expect from the conventional literature, is negative. It tends to depress labour share. And again, for the reasons I just mentioned, we would expect this with service employment. If we just look across, say, retail, tourism, and things like that, you have pretty extensive destandardization within those sectors, and also relatively low union coverage. In Denmark, both the legal protections and, if you like, the institutional protections of the labour market associated with trade union membership offer some greater protection. So we note a positive effect in this case for service employment. This includes security from things that in the Irish case would increase the insecurity associated with service employment, like subsidiarity, outsourcing, subcontracting work through intermediaries who are then able to avoid more stringent labour laws and requirements and so on. But also a more unified wage structure. And this again speaks to the literatures on wage bargaining centralization, which also suggests to us that in contexts with more centralized wage bargaining, again, where the state, employers and unions and so on are at the table together, that unified wage structure provides a much greater sectoral spread of benefits to workers, rather than just focusing them sort of sporadically on key or on particular organizations or particular segments of the labour market. Most significantly, though, the effect, sorry, I keep pausing because I have to move the little window with my face in it so I can see my slides. More significantly, I suppose, is that one of the most consistent effects noted in panel studies is that the share of international trade is seen as universally negative, and certainly is found in panel studies to be universally negative. And increasing trade in a liberal context like Ireland is associated with more global exposure and externalization of risk. And generally what that means is the externalization of risk onto labour. Labour tends to bear the consequences of the relative mobility of capital. It is also more threatened by, or more subject to, the threats of capital flight that are often used to drive down labour conditions and to respond to or to suppress demands for enhanced securities in the workplace and wage bargaining and so on. But in the Danish case, we find, first of all, there's a fundamentally different underlying economic structure. The Danish industrial structure is much more rooted in small, medium enterprises, networks of locally and regionally integrated small, medium enterprises, which are based more on sort of industrial innovation rather than integration into global supply chains. So there's less international vulnerability and exposure. But in studies of the Danish labour market, what we also find amongst studies of those organizations that are engaged in heavier international trade is that they are involved in a process better characterized by incremental change rather than sort of catastrophic or sudden change. So in a liberal context like Ireland, flexibility, particularly corporate flexibility, is seen as a key growth strategy, that corporations are able to move, relocate, set their own conditions and so on, as part of sort of the particularly Irish system of industrial policy. That's not the case in the Danish. In the Danish case, first of all, the underlying structure of small, medium enterprises provides that sort of buffer against the vagaries of international capital, but the way in which change is managed in the Danish economy, again, coupled with the protections associated with Danish institutions, provide a stronger degree of insulation. So in other words, one of the findings is that it's not an inevitability that marketization should be universally depressive or exert a universally depressive effect on labour share. There are differences. And the bottom line is that these institutional differences matter because they channel these effects of globalization, marketization in fundamentally different ways. In Denmark, they can be to the advantage or to the relative advantage or security. I think we'd stretch to calling it advantage, security of labour relative to Ireland, where labour is much, much more exposed. I'll move quickly through these ones, but suffice it to say that we found similar differences across some domains when we started to look at the political economic structure of both these countries. The union effect is much, much stronger in Ireland. As we would expect, unionization is much more concentrated in a narrow range of sectors and public employment. Again, those sectors implicated under social partnership and so on, and a couple of outlier sectors, but with coverage nowhere near as broad as in the Danish case. So the wage premium for those sectors is reflected in the much stronger positive effect that we find on the labour share for unionization in Ireland. The effects of foreign direct investment are negative in the Irish case, as we would expect. Again, the greater presence of FDI, the greater extent of FDI as a total share of GDP has a depressive effect on labour share. And we would expect that, given the practices, the labour practices associated with the FDI sector in Ireland, practices recorded by people like Bill Roach and their studies of greenfielding and double breasting avoidance practices, but also the use of precarious employment and spin-off services employment, which although the incumbent employer can be providing sort of skilled services, the spin-off employment that feeds into those sectors is not necessarily as secure. So when you combine all these effects together, you find a much, much stronger depressive effect on labour share in Ireland relative to the Danish case. And finally, the structure of the welfare system seems to matter considerably. In Ireland, we have a relative absence of any sort of reservation wage effect that you might find in the Nordics or in the Ghent type economies. And again, retrenchment is, slowly eroding those protections. So we certainly can't make the same sort of binary comparisons we could perhaps make in the early 2000s. Things are certainly changing there. But we also have in Ireland, and again, one of the sort of puzzles, I suppose, of these effects is that the funding of the welfare state in both contexts you could see as perhaps equally regressive. In the Danish context, they rely quite considerably on consumption taxes to fund the welfare state. Again, both social protection systems in Ireland and Denmark, to almost as great an extent, do considerable work in reducing the pre and post-market Gini. But again, the funding basis of both of these welfare systems is more or less comparable or quite comparable. They both rely on, to some extent, on very regressive measures like consumption taxes or taxes at the point of consumption. And again, when you consider this in the overall context of the Danish welfare state, it's not that surprising, because given the wider universality of benefits, it is more acceptable in those cases that workers, and indeed perhaps the public at large, will trade off that sort of regression for greater universality of services. So again, because of the underlying political economic structure, these are measures that can be passed with a greater degree of sort of civil and political peace in Nordic countries than they can in what we term LMEs, like in Ireland. So fundamentally, what we noticed in this, or what we tried to conclude from this, is that, well, first of all, the universal accounts, the pooled accounts, shouldn't be relied on to understand singular effects. So if we try and understand sort of the universal effect of foreign direct investment, that we would understand in pool-based studies or panel models as having just one effect. So FDI is universally depressive, unionization is universally positive. While it certainly is the case that they do behave in predictable ways, what this study reveals is that they work in very, very different ways, contingent on the underlying institutional structures of the country in question. And I'll summarize the findings a little bit more in a moment, but just to conclude, I wanted to say perhaps a little bit about how these studies or this sort of broadening out of the factors of inequality is changing some of our approaches to how we conceptualize inequality and class. And I want to return to a paper by Tony Atkinson, or Anthony Atkinson, sorry, from about 10 years ago and the title of the paper was called Factor Shares, the Principal Problem of Political Economy. And in this paper, Atkinson points out that although, yes, there's been a lot of studies over the years that have looked at things like Gini, and indeed focusing on the Gini as a measure of overall sort of societal-wide personal income inequality, has taken the majority of attention, I think, in comparative political economy. In Atkinson's paper, he broadens the definition of inequality beyond just the distributional to look at inequality at points of production. And in this paper, he suggests that, well, actually, if we don't consider what's going on at the point of production, at the formation of national product, then we're really missing a very, very key step in understanding how that sort of society-wide pool of income is set, which is then distributed down through labor and workers in the form of wages and salaries and self-employment income. So in Atkinson's model, he has this model where he says, yes, on the first hand, even though sort of the dynamics of what's going on in the personal income distribution, Gini income inequality down here are very important, we're missing an intermediary step by not looking at how that pool of national product gets split between capital and labor. Now, in our studies, we define, if you like, the tensions between capital and labor here as an outcome, or the outcome of the relative bargaining power of workers. So in other words, the extent to which this national product gets allocated to capital or labor is not purely a functional question, it's a question of power. And it's a question of, on the labor side, what kinds of sort of protections and enhancements to that power can labor access in particular contexts? And on the capital side, what kinds of advantages can they exploit by nature of some of the things which are fundamental to capital, like its relative mobility, its insulation from, in many cases, national taxation legislation, and so on. So we look at this really from the point of view in our paper of an outcome of a power struggle between capital and labor. But in Atkinson's model, he says that yes, even though there are many, many different things that can sort of determine the allocation of national product to capital and labor, there are also other things that happen to that income within these particular pools. On the capital side, some of this can be reinvested, it can be retained as retained profit, and it gets distributed to shareholders as dividends. On the capital side, we have wages, salaries, and we have own account workers, so self-employment income. And the problem, as Atkinson saw it, was that we kind of have two things going on here. We have, first of all, the share of income, the distribution of income to workers. It's not just a question of what's happening at the point of distribution, it's a question of what's happening at the point of production also. But the picture is becoming much more complicated, because not only do we have this division of national product between capital and labor, we also have a blurring of the boundaries between what's happening or what's going to the capital side and the labor side. This includes things like the intermixing of labor and capital income. So labor can have investments in pensions, companies can have employee co-ownership or equity schemes, and they can be sort of private, or they can be, if they're publicly listed, they can have stock options and so on. And also debt. Again, if we look at the rise in personal debt over the past 20 years, again, debt servicing and the issuing of debt became, in the pre-recession years, a key source of income for capital. But it remains tied to the debt of labor, the indebtedness of labor remains tied to the capital side as debt grows to make up the gap or the shortfall in real wage growth, which developed countries have experienced more or less uninterruptedly over the past 20 years. So in Atkinson's account, he further draws attention to the fact that although for a long time we've kind of seen this as a very, very discrete division between capital and labor, there are processes at work that are causing this discrete boundary to break down to the extent that we cannot really necessarily treat these as separate entities anymore. And what seems to be emerging as we go, or as we kind of delve deeper into the housing crisis, is that this is really carving out new domains and new areas of inequality based around access to or ownership of assets, rent yielding assets, and so on. So if we look at this paper from Atkins from just this year, they offer a concept which they refer to as the asset economy. And they suggest that, first of all, the definition or the concept that they use to explain sort of the modern household or the asset-based household is the distinction between what they call Keynesian households and Minskian households. Now, the paper is based very much on their understanding of Australian and American households, and they make a very, very sort of discrete and overdrawn historical distinction between Keynesian households of the past and Minskian households of the present. But nonetheless, it is a useful illustration, I suppose, for this further blurring of the boundaries between capital and labor. And according to their approach, the Keynesian household of the past was one where a single income home could purchase a home of stable value, and the home was the principally a site of consumption. In other words, you bought the home on a single income, you paid for the home, and you enjoyed it for its utility, its use value, rather than its exchange. But more fundamentally, in what they refer to as the Keynesian household era, our conventional sociological models of social class were tied to employment, and employment was in turn tied to your ability to pay for that home. And there was a sort of a synonymy between how we conceptualized social class in terms of someone's occupation, and that occupation was seen as a relatively stable indicator of one's life chances or their position in the social hierarchy. The model that they forward today is that of what they call the Minskian household. So they suggest that today, rather than us living in this sort of context of Keynesian households of the past, we now live in a Minskian household where the object of purchasing a home, again, assuming you can access the home, there's generational effects here as well. Your principal motivation to access that home is not to enjoy it for its utility, but to advance capital gains. So in this model, they suggest Minskian households are drawn into the nexus of assets and asset price appreciation and their participation in capital markets, because of these structural changes that have been experienced in the labor and increasingly housing markets over the past 20 years. So Minskian households are drawn into this nexus, and in the paper, they suggest that this has now occurred to such an extent that really, rather than looking at sort of employment as a basis of social stratification, we should instead be looking at access to assets. And the more kind of salient distinction or dimension of social class is whether a household has access to an asset or does not have access to an asset. So this has engendered what sociologists are now trying to understand as the delinking of occupation from stratification. So they suggest that whereas the Keynesian household, you might reasonably have accepted that there was a synonymy between occupation and ability to pay. Now that's no longer the case. Generations of individuals and households are locked out of home ownership because of, again, in Ireland profoundly and particularly because of the nature of the housing system. But interestingly, if we go back to the comparison of Ireland and Denmark, and this goes back to work done by Patrick Gallagher, is that the Danish have one of the highest extents of indebtedness as well. Their household mortgage debt, if you look at it just as a total debt to total income ratio, that the Danes are actually one of the most indebted in Europe. But again, the capacity of households and families to withstand that is again linked to underlying institutional aspects, underlying features of the institutions of those economies. So again, it's not an inevitability that workers and households are necessarily penalized for their participation in the debt economy. It depends on the underlying institutional structure and social protection structure of the economy in question. But nonetheless, what this is raising is fundamental questions about how we conceptualize social class, and whether, if we rely simply on just looking at Gini or looking at, say, one aspect of income inequality, that we're only getting sort of a partial picture. And indeed, if we look at this in the round, what we see here is that even though for Ireland over the course of the 1980s, 1990s, the Gini coefficient remained relatively stable, again, that gap between pre and post tax was considerable. So the state taxation and welfare system was doing reasonably hard work in reducing that Gini coefficient. We also had pretty strong growth in the income shares of the top 1%, which have again since returned to growth in the post GFC era, and a considerable fall in Labour's share, which has now restarted. Again, going back to that almost uninterrupted trend decline from the 1980s, Ireland has now returned to this. What this is raising is serious questions about the future of workers' collective bargaining power and security across the world, because this is a pattern that we see repeated in many, many different countries. In China, we're seeing the same thing. Now, there's a resurgence of interest of late in Asia-Pacific countries and whether they fit the standard sort of narratives of labour share decline or inequality growth. And the short answer is, while they're experiencing the same trend declines, they don't fit the same institutional drivers, don't hold, for obvious reasons. I mean, there's considerable diversity here. But it's also happening in countries as diverse as the US, Portugal, and this is a source from the ILO Global Wage Report, transition economies like Mexico. More fundamentally, what seems to have happened in the past 10 years is almost a complete erasure of the gains. And again, a lot of this was due to sort of functional changes in GDP and GNI over the course of the crisis. But there was a period of growth in this period over 2007 to 2010, where there was potential, at least, for a real shift in the fortunes of labour's compensation relative to capital. Again, most of those countries that were on the trend decline side pre-2007 switched to the growth side. And again, a lot of this is kind of functional in terms of what was going on with GDP, GNI. But in the post-crisis era, 2010 to 2015, most of those gains have been reversed. If we look at Ireland, it's sitting down here at a net decline of about 6 percentage points over that period, 2010 to 2015. So that decline is increasing, has gone back to its more or less uninterrupted trend decline that it was experiencing since the 1980s. So the Great Recession has been very much an aberration in this respect. So the bottom line of this paper, I suppose, put all together, is that, first of all, if we rely simply on pooled models, we're missing an awful lot of these complexities. We're missing important sort of nuances about whether certain factors are inevitably stressors, or whether certain factors, say like foreign direct investment, whether unionization inevitably and universally work as stressors or protections. And the fundamental lesson is that, yes, while in many cases they can work in different ways, and it's very, very much dependent on underlying economic and political and institutional structure. But the bottom line, I think, in terms of incorporating labour share, is that despite, and again, I note there were some recent articles in the news media, particularly about Ireland, about sort of the hard work that Ireland's redistribution system does in terms of keeping inequality low. That's only true insofar as we look at one dimension of inequality. If we look at fractile shares in terms of the top 1%, but especially if we look at labour share, and also if we look at things like wealth inequality, the picture is very, very much different. So fundamentally, inequality is multidimensional, and we are really only getting a partial picture of the overall fortunes of workers and households if we focus on Gini alone. And finally, what seems to be emerging, the more we sort of focus in on these sort of relative class positions in terms of capital, labour, in terms of bargaining power, relative bargaining power in terms of asset ownership, non-ownership, and so on, there is a growing suggestion that we are seeing the consolidation of a very, very new class dynamic that is not rooted anymore in employment, but is rooted in one's position on the capital labor side, but also in terms of the asset ownership, non-ownership side. So that's all I've got for now, Paul. If you want to take over with some questions, and I know it's the 20th of December, so really sincerely thanks to everyone who came along for enduring that and for staying as long as you did.
No, thanks a million, Owen. Nothing to endure. A lot of really interesting material there. Just encourage everybody, if you have any questions for Owen, put them in the Q&A function on the bottom. Just to open up, I'm very curious, this Adkins material. I suppose it seems intuitive in that it also kind of reflects political sort of stories, you know, the idea of generation rent and the fact that, you know, those sort of age differences that we see in, say, voting patterns, the rise of Sinn Féin, stuff like that might be linked to sort of a class dynamic bifurcated by age and ownership and everything else. So that's very interesting. I suppose I just, seeing as you raised it, how would you incorporate those sort of asset kind of holding class divides into that model, or would that be a separate sort of model specification in terms of your analysis? Sort of, if you were doing that now in light of those sort of recent insights, how would you incorporate that into the analysis as presented?
It's a real problem, I think, because if you look at studies of the top 1%, a lot of those studies look at diversification of the incomes of the top 1%. So there's a sense in those studies that there's a very qualitatively different income composition for those groups. And a lot of that focuses on income derived from the capital side. So whether that's sort of straightforward interest, you know, deposit interests, or whether it's investments, or whether it's properties and so on. But again, there's another sort of emergent literature which would be around rentierism. Again, you know, Marxists have known about rentierism for centuries, but political economy is kind of catching up with that now in a very specific way. We're looking at housing rent. But from a computational point of view, it's really, really difficult because the labour share studies rely very much on the national accounts. And what you're going to get from that principally is retained earnings on the capital side and compensation on the labour side. If you look at the income shares of the top 1%, again, you're talking about another series. Again, a lot of that is derived from banded taxation data. So a lot of that data really depends on, it depends on a few things, but it depends very much on the reporting conventions in the country as to whether they're actually capturing capital returns. And the consensus in those studies is that actually there's too much inter-country variation. So you look at top incomes exclusive of capital gains. And then the other problem is, how do you actually capture the wealth effect? I know Aidan Regan has done work on this, and a lot of people at NERI have been doing work on this as well for a while. Is that how do you actually kind of capture the household wealth effect? Do you look at property incomes? Do you look at ownership of second or additional properties and so on? And again, people like Michael Byrne have been doing work on this with regard to landlords and landlordism. So that's a whole other dimension of asset ownership. And they all kind of, it's partly a data problem and it's partly a conceptual problem that we would like to kind of mix and match, or really kind of disaggregate in detail at the household level who is getting what from which asset and so on, but we really can't. So they're still kind of separate. I don't have a good answer for it, but for the moment, I think for data reasons, it's probably going to be studied as a separate kind of entity across these different domains for a while.
I suppose a related question, again, using that different sort of model that you introduced at the end of your presentation. We have a question. What is the impact of the new social model, asset participation, for example, on collective bargaining? And how does such bargaining adapt to these trends?
Oh, I see the question here. Sorry, from Michael. Yeah, it's a new social model. Michael, could you say more about what you mean by the new social model? Sorry.
I suppose, Michael, we can move on to the next question, but you can sort of have an addendum to that, maybe a second piece in the Q&A function there, if you'd like, Michael, and we can pick that up. So another attendee asks,
sorry, Michael.
Can you say more about the networked SME structure in Denmark and the difference between it and Ireland in terms of innovation?
Yeah, if Sean was here, I'd be deferring to Sean, but I'll kind of draw on Sean's work for this, and you can blame him if we're grossly misrepresented. So I suppose there's a couple of dimensions that are used to differentiate, and this would be in the varieties of capitalism literature. They tend to parse countries up into liberal market economies, coordinated market economies. And one of the features of CMEs would be things like the embeddedness of innovation more in domestic firms. So if you look at kind of the Nokias of Finland, in the Danish case, we would have things like particular niches in engineering and biotech, in sort of food processing and food systems innovation and so on. And the conventional, I suppose, understanding of those is that, first of all, while they're more networked in terms of their codependencies, they're more regionally networked. So that would include, amongst the Nordics, a more sort of tightly integrated system of international exchange within that particular bloc. And where that difference is seen as significant then is in Ireland. So if you consider that sort of system of innovation as the model of growth, or not a model of growth, as a key aspect of growth in the Danish case, in the Irish case, again, because of this historical lack of the industrial base and so on from which to innovate from, it becomes, for various reasons, and better people have written the history of this, much more dependent on international investors and international capital. So again, to the extent that, and again, we have been successful in terms of growing some of those clusters and things like pharmaceuticals, computing, and so on, and they are networked to some extent, but they're not as regionally embedded. So again, they're much more responsive to international price signaling, to changes in, for example, changes in work, skill demands, and so on. So we tend to see things happening more quickly, I guess, in the Irish case with regards to the outsourcing of labor, and the switching of labor. In terms of innovation, again, what we find in the Irish case, if you look at indicators like, some of the more crude indicators like R&D intensity, and I hope I'm quoting the figures right here, that the per capita spend on R&D intensity is much higher in the Irish case. So Ireland has to do, as far as I know, if we look at this in terms of attraction, much more sort of the heavy lifting at state level in terms of attracting and incentivizing innovation. And it does this through its organizations, like, for example, God, I'm still thinking in terms of UK nomenclature, the Irish Industrial, what's it called? The IDA, I'm sorry, in the 80s and 90s, and organizations like that. So there's no name on that. Sorry, I don't know if that clarifies it at all, but if you want to ask anything else, please go ahead. And sorry, Michael, you've asked as well there, what is the new way of analyzing capital labor? What are the implications for collective bargaining? And how does collective bargaining adapt? Michael, that's a really good question. The short answer is I really don't know. I don't think the trends for Ireland give us any cause for optimism, to be quite honest. I think to the extent that there would be a revival of some kind of consociational bargaining system, there's no sense in which it would be any more devolved than it was during the social partnership era. And even, if you look at what's been going on within some of those former partners, say from the Celtic Tiger era, a lot of conditions within those sectors have been eroded further. This goes from everything like, this is present in aspects of occupations like teaching, like medicine, and so on, previously secure sectors and that. So I certainly wouldn't be optimistic in terms of thinking that it marks any sort of potential revival of consociational bargaining. I think Ireland's level of density is far too small, and I think there's no institutionalized framework in place for the kind of centralization that we see in the Danish, or indeed in the wider Ghent countries. There's simply no precedent for it. And I think if you look at studies that people, I think I mentioned them in the paper, and that people like Bill Roach have done, it's the practices of multinationals with respect to their engagement with labor have become so individualized and fragmented. And again, the legal precedent for this fragmentation is very secure as well. I don't think there is any real potential for sort of corralling that into something that could look more centralized. Quite the opposite. I think perhaps COVID, even the latitude given to employers that we've seen in that respect, makes me even less optimistic. So I'm not sure if that's what you meant by the implications for that for collective bargaining. The other thing, I suppose, that has been flagged in some quarters as a cause for optimism would be things like profit sharing arrangements. So I suppose things like employee equity schemes, share ownership, and so on. I don't really see those as a democratizing force, to be quite honest. I think they're an effective HR tool in terms of aligning the interests of employees with the share price and the performance of the firm, but I don't think they represent a democratization of workers into the capital side. And again, if we consider what's going on in terms of the housing market, to the extent that, say, you could say class is now demarcated by participation or non-participation and asset ownership, again, the returns to those assets are largely going to institutional investors, larger landlords, certainly not sort of small household level landlords and so on. And again, disregarding the fact that, or the question over whether, you know, property or housing ever should be a route to profitability. So I guess I'm very pessimistic about it, I suppose, but I'd be really curious to hear your opinions on it, because I know you've done a lot of work in that area as well. Sorry, Paul, should I just read through the questions, or did you have?
Sure. No, fire away.
Noel, yeah. So one of the graphs showed that the level of labour share is high. It is indeed, yeah. Let me just share my screen back again, and I'll just pop you back to that. I'll pop you back to that slide. So part of this is down to the way it's calculated. So if you look here, we've got just take it from the 60 level. I mean, it's consistently higher from 60 to 80 here in the Irish case, and it's relatively lower here in the Danish case. It's just around 60. Even if we just take the overall level, say in 2000, you've got approximately 55, 56 here in the Danish, and was it looking at 2000? Okay, 2000 is a pretty bad example, but you get the idea. It's consistently higher. Part of this is due to sectoral composition. So if you take two sectors like agriculture, the labour share is relatively high, and it varies by time as well. In the 1960s, you'd be looking at probably a 90-95% labour share if you just looked at that as a ratio of, say, compensation to output in the agricultural sector. If you look at it in finance, it's much lower. Because of the productivity in finance, you're looking at, we did do a sectoral decomposition in the paper. I think it's somewhere around 10 to 15%, but I could be totally wrong there. So correct me if I'm wrong in my own paper. So the overall average then is sort of the net effect of all that sectoral complexity. So this is a combination, if you like, of, you know, finance, agriculture, industry, manufacturing, and so on. But what's key in these studies, and again, I didn't mention it really much in the paper, what's key in these studies is the dynamics and the changes rather than the levels. So the model specification fundamentally takes away the levels anyway, because it looks at it in terms of differences. So the outcome is the change from one period to the next rather than the level. So what we're kind of interested in is that once you kind of average that out, then what's the secular trend within that, and what we're focusing on here by looking at this kind of decomposition is movement and trends rather than levels. So the level might be different, but the rate of change, the level in Denmark might be lower, the level in Ireland might be higher, but the change dynamics are very, very much different. And it's this sort of really rapid change in the 1990s, 2000s that marks Ireland as worst, if you like, rather than, despite the fact that its labour share is actually higher.
We have another question from our director, one of our co-directors, Tom McDonnell. What can individual countries do to reverse declining labour share? Do the solutions require international cooperation, for example, directives at an EU level? Big question there, Eoin.
That's a huge. I guess I could answer it by saying what I think the consensus, I think, just from looking across not just the labour share, but also the top income studies and Gini studies, will be what are the factors that are most consistently shown to act as stressors on income inequality. And if you look at one of the last publications from Atkinson, was in his book on inequality, he's got this list of kind of factors that he sees as most productive. And one of them is, I didn't go too much into this in the paper, but one of the effects we found is that leftist political seats don't really seem to contribute anything to changes in the labour share. It's not surprising if you look at somewhere like Ireland, because again, to the extent that the left is more represented in Parliament, it tends to be in a coalitional setup where labour-friendly policies are kind of eroded and the overall and the overall kind of pro capital thrust. To be very specific, I think one of the things certainly would be control of the financial sector. Profitability within finance is seen as one of the key factors driving the income shares of the top 1%, which again is sort of, if you look at it in terms of the overall income distribution, is functionally related to the labor share as well. So it implies that, you know, more diversion of national product through capital vis-a-vis financial channels, the less that's available to labor. So I think measures that are geared very much towards reducing the impunity of the financial sector, and that would include, and that can be a very broad-based solution. I think that would include things like reining in or putting a much firmer footing on the taxation system. I think, I'm not sure if Cian's on the call here, but I know the work that he's done recently there with Kieran Allen on Ireland's taxation arrangement, finding some system of kind of standardizing and eliminating those loopholes in conjunction with very, very tight controls on transactions on the capital and finance side would be a very, very key step. I know Piketty in his work was quite adamant about doing this in a very sort of light touch way with the nominal, you know, financial transaction tax. I think the changes that are required are much more fundamental. At a minimum, it would require a complete overhaul at an EU level, certainly, of the statutory footing for collective bargaining, and that would need to operate on a consociational basis, like we see in Denmark, maybe Germany to a lesser extent, where you've got sort of periodic renegotiations. And in a way, I'd imagine to even make that politically palatable, it would have to be in a way that accommodates flexicurity. It would have to be a system where there's periodic renegotiation, there's accommodation of new conditions in product markets and so on. So whatever that statutory system would look like, I think in the Irish case, certainly it would be a very, very flexible system. I couldn't even imagine the amount of work or the distance we would have to go to get there. But those are my thoughts on the two things that would be most consequential, I suppose, in terms of reversing it. Would be protections, would be sort of actions against growth on the capital side vis-a-vis finance, and then a complete overhaul and a statutory system for labour on the bargaining side.
Modest asks.
I know that's completely unhelpful. So.
Oh no, well, I mean, it's useful to know where we stand on that front. Just curious as well, actually, perhaps a minor point, but you mentioned in the presentation even that the kind of social wage element of it and how it interacts, but that the funding of the social wage in both cases is actually regressive in the sense. In that sense, has that changed over time? Like, is there a sense in which, say, the social wage benefits accruing to, you know, the labor side are self-funded? Are they funded from taxes that probably fall mostly on them? Or in the past, might there have been more of a sort of, even, you know, after those distributional pies went, were there further transfers in essence from the capital side to the labor side, to your knowledge, or has that changed?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you look at it historically in the Danish case, I mean, there was a much more fundamental flaw, I suppose, under the social protection system in that regard. If you go back to the Candlestel Agreement in the 1920s, it was a huge land redistribution system, which essentially transferred land from what would have been, I guess, the equivalent of the Danish estates, and created a very, very stable network of small, medium farmers, which became, for many, many decades, the voting base of the Social Democrats. So you had, I guess, from the inception of the modern state, a very, very clear commitment to redistribution. But in the enaction of that redistribution, it also created a very, very stable political bloc that made the measures that came afterwards palatable. And certainly the shape of that definitely changed over the years, and the nature of that investment changed. And you're right, yeah, it is one of the enduring puzzles, I guess, of the system, that it is funded to such a considerable extent through what would be seen in other cases as regressive measures like consumption taxes. But it is changing. It is changing very much in the Nordics. I mean, the Social Democrat majority, the uninterrupted kind of 60, 70-year majority is gone. We're seeing challenges from the right in Nordic countries across Europe. In the Danish case, we saw in the 90s a commitment to flexicurity, and now that's hardening even further with conditionality around benefits access. So this sort of classical kind of model of the Ghent system, where, you know, the state subvents the unions and the unions disperse benefits in the forms of an index percentage of your previous wage. You know, a lot of that we can see is being actively eroded. But I think the interesting thing is that there is there is a model there for funding that we have a reasonably sort of safe evidence base has worked. And that would be the system where, say the flex security system of the 90s, where the reservation wage is able to kind of accommodate a degree of labor market flexibility because employers can sort of hire and fire and they can depend on that social reservation wage as a protection for labor. So we can see how there are ways to fund the reservation wage and sustain it in a way that also accommodates flexibility. And I think the evidence from that period, and from the Danes, especially in the 1990s, 2000s, is very, very interesting because it shows how it's not an inevitable trade-off that, the greater penetration of capital requires unfettered insecurity for labor. It doesn't, and I think it's a really interesting proof. But on the funding side, I guess there's the extent to which that would be politically possible in Ireland to institute that kind of funding model, I think is more or less impossible because we simply don't have that institutional history. We don't have that social history of redistribution. We don't have a stable political consensus around parties with an emphasis on redistribution. So in terms of how you might apply that sort of funding model to another case, again, I'm very pessimistic about that too, because there's so many kind of historical institutional factors there that are key to how it worked and how it lasted for so long in the Danish case.
I suppose that might relate to your kind of commentary at the end there, but just a follow-up question from Tom. What reforms in the capital tax side would you like to see?
What reforms? I talked a little bit about this in another paper where it's in the same journal, and I guess I can, if anyone's interested, do drop me a line and I can send you the paper. But on the capital side, with regard to my other study on the income shares of the top 1%, one of the factors that we pointed out on that was that if you go back to if you look at this sort of in a post-war context for countries like the UK and the US, and again, part of how the UK funds the war effort in the 40s is by issuing bonds and so on to fund the war, but also raising the top marginal tax rate to over 90%. And one of the key sort of factors driving top income growth over that period from the 70s to the 80s is a fall in that rate, a fall in the top marginal tax rate all the way down to kind of 33% by the tail end of the Thatcher era. So I guess given the extent to which a lot of that has individualized, I suppose the only way really to address it is to raise the top marginal rate. And again, I've written on this elsewhere where I suggested, what benefits would that have in Ireland? Ireland does a terrible job of policing corporate tax enforcement. It likely does an equally poor job, as we know from kind of offshoring and so on, and all the opportunities that are available to hide that, of policing capital tax enforcement. So I suppose on the capital side, it would be a modest measure, but unless we see fundamental changes in sort of taxation governance along the lines that we're seeing mooted in the wake of the Apple case, if they ever do materialize, I would say that any changes to that taxation would need to be coupled with very, very far-reaching institutional changes or changes in the attitude or the orientation of the state, or the inclination of the state, I suppose, to police and enforce them. Well, I guess really, really short answer would be raise the top marginal tax rate, pursue Piketty's model of a nominal transactional tax, and reform the system of policing and enforcement, which are all completely unfeasible in my point of view, but it is what the evidence suggests.
Well, if we don't, I think we've run through all the questions. So unless another one comes in, just before the buzzer here, I might take the opportunity to thank you, Eoin. Thank you for a great presentation, and thank you. The Q&A was equally enlightening and interesting. Just for everybody watching, the NERI seminar series will come back in the new year. We have a session coming up in February, PUP Transitions to Employment. That's Wednesday, the 2nd of February, with Jeff Twan O'Reilly and Michael McNeil's Nellis from the Department of Social Protection. So that should be very interesting. You can join us and you'll see details of that on our site. So given that, it just leaves me to wish all of you a happy Christmas and hope you enjoy the break, and we'll see you in the new year. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time.